you've heard of the brain, the left has two parts, your left brain or right brain. Well, my memory is divided into two parts. One side I call the graveyard. The other side I call the junkyard. And my stories come from my memory. And that's why people sometimes ask me, why do you tell so many stories about dead people? That's because I have so many in that graveyard. And it gets filled up more and more each year. Sometimes when I'm telling stories, though, things from the junkyard bleed in. These are things that I'll be telling a story. Connie will say, well, no one in your audience is going to recognize that. You need to explain that. And so I was born in 1943. I'll be 75 this summer. There are a lot of things that people that were maybe born 70s, 80s, on beyond this century, would not recognize. I make hundreds on all those Facebook quizzes. Can you recognize this? Can you name that object? For example, a skate key. I know what a skate key is. A rotary dial phone. Yes, I can even remember a no-dial phone. We would pick up the phone, and I would wait, and the operator would say, "Number, please." The adapter, you put in a 45 RPM record to make it fit on the spindle. Okay, I ran across one this morning. I was yesterday morning driving to class. It was that song, "You Got Trouble in River City," Music Man. And he was talking about pool hall and everything. And he mentioned Sin Sin. Does anybody remember Sin Sin? I remember when I was a kid, the boy across the street, he was about 8 years older, whenever he wanted to go out and he might want to sneak a smoke or go somewhere where he'd have a beer, he always wanted to make sure he had his Sin Sins because they would cover up the smell of tobacco or so forth. Today I was thinking I always like to bring a memento from my parents or something, and I found this, and it's something we had back, I remember this was in 47, and you had these machines that had these blanks in them that looked like this and had good luck and a horseshoe in the middle. You could put money in it, and then you could stamp out your name or whatever letter you wanted around the circle. You're shaking your head. Does anybody recognize this? Yeah. It has Salisbury, North Carolina, my father's name, July the 4th, 1947. So I brought that with me. So I'll be 75, so much has changed. I grew up in the 40s and the 50s. I grew up in Salisbury, a town not far from here, in a working class neighborhood, Chestnut Hill. And it's so completely different. For example, not many families had a car. And those that had a car, there were no families that had two cars. But many families didn't have a car at all. We walked places. We walked to school, we walked to the library, the movie theater, to town. I lived on a block, and there were several men that worked at the Spencer shops where Southern Railway did its mechanics. It's now the North Carolina Transportation Museum. There were several men that worked on it, and they would walk by my house carrying their black lunch pails down to the bus stop, get on the bus, and ride to Spencer. And my family made its living because people didn't have so many cars. My grandfather started Kirk's Taxi well before 1920. And people would call taxis to pick them up at the grocery store, to take them to the doctor's office, and so on. The other thing that was different is that not many, my mother was the only mother working outside the home. All the other mothers stayed home. So there were usually the houses that were open during the day, and people were doing things. And the women socialized during the day. They could sometimes be on the front porch together, shelling peas or doing other things or helping each other out. And as kids playing, we always knew that houses were open. We would run in and out of each other's houses. There weren't any locked doors, things like that. The other thing is that this was right after the war, 1945, 46, 47. When men came back from the war, there wasn't much housing. So many of the houses on my block were multi-generational. Grandmothers, grandparents, parents, and children. My best friend across the street, my friend Dolores down the street, multi-generational houses. So it was really quite a different world. In some ways, though, we were a bit ahead of the curve, and people now are trying to regain what we had. For example, you hear a lot today about farm to table. Local, eat locally. Everything's got to be farm to table. We were the original farm to table people. We didn't have any choice but farm to table. Now, both my parents were just one generation away from living on a farm. But in the summer, for example, local truck farmers would drive and park their trucks on the street. The women would go out and buy squash, tomatoes, green beans, corn, all those things. That's what we would eat during the summer. In the winter, we didn't eat cantaloupes, squash, tomatoes, and so forth in the winter. It just wasn't available. But we ate it in the summer, and people would can so they could have green beans and things. We didn't even have fresh green beans in the winter. Now, I'm just going to interject. I have a green bean story because probably not everybody has a green bean story. But I grew up in the South, and I knew that my people would get their beans started shortly after lunch. And green beans were no exceptions. They cooked a long time. So a friend of mine was visiting me, and she wasn't from the South and lived in California. We were planning dinner, and I said, we can have some chicken breasts and this, that, and the other. I said, but we need something green. She said, well, what about green beans? I said, green beans? Are you crazy? I said, we don't have time to cook green beans. She said, what do you mean you don't have time to cook green beans? I said, we should put those on shortly after lunch. To this day, she cannot adjust to what she calls mushy green beans, which has been cooked and cooked and cooked. We also had Mr. Sloop. Mr. Sloop was our butter and egg man, and once a week he delivered to our neighborhood. He delivered eggs and butter and milk to women and fulfilled their order that way. I can remember his buttermilk to this day. It was had creamy, but had little grains of butter in it, like rice grains. And I used to love to drink it. It was almost salty. It was so refreshing. So he delivered once a week, and not only we were the first farm to table, but we were the first composters too. Because all during the week, women had been saving their peelings, their scraps, all their leftovers in their slop bucket. Every household had a slop bucket. This story is named appropriately, Mr. Sloop and the Slop Bucket. And they would put their peelings, their leftovers, or everything in the slop bucket, put a lid on it, put it somewhere where it didn't smell up the house or everything. And after he made his deliveries, he would collect the slop and feed it to his pigs or use it on his farm in some way. But we've gotten away from that. Women don't have slop buckets in their kitchen or bacon grease cans or things like that, except for my Aunt Dorothy. My Aunt Dorothy had a slop bucket in her kitchen until the day she died in 2008. Now, she didn't have Mr. Sloop to come by and collect it. So what did she do when her slop bucket filled up? She threw it in the garbage. The other thing we had, and I know that people have it today, but it seems we had it in some kind of a richer way then, is we had connection with the people that lived around us. Our neighborhood was a tightly knit neighborhood. Our lives were interwoven. We knew things. Well, at the evening we didn't have TV till I was in the second grade, so we'd sit on the front porch, and people would talk, and they would share stories, and they would talk about their lives and their problems and issues they're having. And people got to know each other, and people helped each other. And we were very interconnected. As I said, the children would run in and out of each people's houses all day long. We did the same as adults did the same. For example, my mother was the only working mother at that time, and my babysitter lived 2 doors down. Her name was Mrs. Butcher. She's in that graveyard part now. But I have a story. I've told stories about her, along with my mother and everybody else. But she was our babysitter, and she didn't come the front way with the sidewalk. She walked the back path from her back door to our back door. And we were all day long back and forth across that back path. And, if Mama was cooking supper and she needed something, she'd say, Dottie Jean, I need a couple eggs. Run down to Miss Butcher's and see if she's got them, and take the back way. That meant be in a hurry. It was a faster way. And so that path sort of symbolized our connection and our interconnectedness, interdependence. I have a really, Miss Butcher and her sister Louise, I say I have 6 parents. They were 2 of the 6. We couldn't even do Santa Claus on Christmas morning until they were present. But they were so much a part of family. I have a story, when I tell it to people, they think it's really weird. But Miss Butcher and Louise and their mother, that was a multi-generational, two-generational house too, they lived in a house that had running water and plumbing, but it did not have hot water. Now, this was the 40s and early 50s, did not have hot water. So if Miss Butcher wanted to wash dishes and do things, she'd have to heat water on the stove and so forth. The same for taking a bath. It would entail that. Well, at some point, I guess in agreement with my parents or whatever happened, but every Saturday afternoon, first Miss Butcher and then her sister Louise would walk that back path from their house to our house. Miss Butcher would say, for example, be wearing her robe with her towel over her arm, her bar of soap, and she always wore, you can't find them now, I've looked, wool felt slippers. And they might have been the original peep-toe shoes, but they weren't the main toe that was out. She had bad corn, so she cut out the little toe on each one of her slippers. So she would come, take her bath, go back. Her sister Louise would then follow with her robe, her towel over her arm, her bar of soap, and go into our bathroom and take a bath. My brother and I would ignore it. It was perfectly normal. We didn't think anything about two people coming into our house to take a bath. And I didn't think anything about it till years later, and I happened to mention the story, and people looked at me, are you kidding? Are you serious? But yes, that's true. I like the word intimacy, connectedness, the same sort of thing, but it's not, I hesitate to use that. When you say the word intimacy, people think of physical intimacy, but this was an emotional, familial, family intimacy that we had with a lot of people when I was growing up. I have been thinking about that and those kind of connections, and the universe gives you things you need and you're looking for. And I have this book that is a very inspiring book to me. It's called Invisible Lines of Connection by Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. And he tells the kind of stories I like to tell and writes the kind of stories I hope to write. And he talks about connection all the way through this. In fact, his view, along with the view of some other theologians I've read, is that God is in the connections, in the relationships. And so he has a quote, and I'd like to read it. Don't tell me I didn't put a marker. Yes. I'm going to paraphrase it. I'm going to put he talks about the subjects of his stories, and I'm going to put my own graveyard people in here. He says, I'm just trying to push interconnectedness to its ultimate expression. These characters, Uncle Bill, Aunt Virgie, Nanny Kirk, Leela Butcher, Louise, they're all here all the time. So are all the others I've forgotten or repressed or never knew. Everyone who ever lived, everything that ever was, they're all present and connected, pulling, tugging, tickling, feeding, shouting, shooting, loving one another. The primary job of a story is to arrange a few of them into a verbal bouquet so that we may, from a safe distance, contemplate them and their relationship, their interdependence. And I feel that's what we had it, and it's enriched my life and enriches my story. I've always wanted to write something about that back path. We used that back path so much that we wore the grass down. It just became a red dirt path from our house to Miss Butcher's house. So I've written this poem, and again, both of these are my graveyard people, and I think I tell these stories, I write these stories so I can keep a connection with them. It keeps them alive for me. It's called The Back Path. Some of you might know Miss Butcher's the subject of one of my other stories called Half a Glass of Water a Day. She believed it was wrong to drink more than half a glass of water a day. But anyway, Miss Butcher rose before the birds, took her cup of coffee, which didn't count toward her ration of half a glass of water a day, to her screened back porch, where each summer morning she sat listening to the birds in her garden. One summer evening, when he was 4, my brother announced he'd be virtuous too, get up with the birds the next morning, join her for coffee. Imitating her, he chirped, "It's the best part of the day." Next morning before light, before the birds tuned up, sleepy-headed, he walked the back path from our back door to hers, where she waited for him with a cup of sweet, milky coffee. I like to think of that moment of peace for my brother, the two of them a sitting still life. She, stately, gray-haired, the age of our grandmother. He, an angel of a child in seersucker pajamas, sipping coffee, listening to the birds sing. Thank you.